The differentiated marriage is one where the more I am allowed to be myself, the more I have to give you. And I think sometimes that's what's sort of unconsciously running in the background, is that if we don't believe the same way, how can this marriage last? But that doesn't actually represent what healthy marriages are.
Welcome to the In Her Image podcast, where we seek and celebrate our Mother God through scriptures, the arts, and everyday life in many other ways. We are very happy to once again have with us Valerie Hamaker, who has been on our podcast 2 other times, one very recently. And when we were having that conversation, we knew that there was going to be so much more that we wanted to talk about. And so we kind of arranged to continue the conversation, but to focus more on something a little bit different. So Valerie, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be back.
We did, an intro with that last one. So Valerie is a therapist. She is an advocate for those who are going through faith journeys. Your background was in marriage and family therapy, correct?
I'm a licensed professional counselor, but I chose to specialize in marriage, couple, and families. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yes. So that is really what we are going to focus on in this conversation, which is why we wanted to reach out to her and have this conversation with her, because we know she has done so much work with families, with couples, and learning to build bridges of understanding and connection. And when it comes to the feminine divine, when it comes to Heavenly Mother and journeys around faith or belief with this, there are times when that draws couples closer together, where it helps them to revitalize things, to build even greater partnership. And we've heard from some of our listeners the beautiful ways in which that has happened in their life as they have embraced this doctrine more fully. And also, there are other listeners who it has become more of a struggle learning how to navigate their intimate relationships as their belief in these things have maybe shifted or changed, or how important it is to them when maybe others don't understand. And so this can look in a number of different ways. There are some of our listeners who have expressed how their spouse left the church, and that led them to start looking at things differently. And they found their mother along the way, and she has been a great support to them, but they're maybe navigating mixed belief or mixed faith relationships where their partner is out, but they're trying to stay in this more kind of nuanced way where their understanding of their divine parents has expanded, and they're wanting to embrace that while also navigating a relationship with a spouse who is no longer spiritual or a part of the church, and maybe spiritual in a different way. We also have listeners who are navigating relationships with people who are very traditional and orthodox, and where maybe they are afraid of this shift and change because it is not something that is talked a lot about from the official church leadership. And so there are so many different ways that this can look, and that it does look for our listeners. Again, a spouse, like the male partner, discovered the mother first and introduces her to their wife, and it's just this beautiful thing, or it just is such a wide array. But regardless of what this looks like for you, all of us are in mixed belief relationships in some way or another, because we are not the same human being as our partners, as our family members. And so regardless of what that looks like, if there's one really orthodox, traditional LDS partner and not, or someone out or not, or they're both navigating nuance together, or whatever it may be. And so we really wanted to have this conversation with someone who could help us give our listeners some more tools in understanding how to approach those relationships, and how to approach conversations, and how to be more likely to be successful and build connection instead of furthering fear and things like that. So thank you, Valerie, for being willing to have this conversation and help us and our listeners with this.
This is a topic that is just near and dear to my heart. Honestly, I care so much about married relationships, and always have. It's been my favorite form of clinical work. And so just integrating it into my faith crisis and faith expansion work is something that I thoroughly enjoy. And I think it's profoundly needed right now in our space.
Absolutely. So we want to start by kind of asking, again, there are couples who have really been able to navigate this well, and there are others who really struggle. And are there certain things that make it more likely just off the bat, whether that be personality or whatever it may be, that make it especially hard to navigate or especially successful?
Yeah. I think that oftentimes when one of the partners goes on a faith journey, all that's happening is it's going to expose some of the already existing struggles in the marriage on steroids, right? So in other words, when there's a couple that has certain kinds of resiliencies and they have done hard things before, like say, for example, health issues or maybe a loss of a job or something like that, and they've kind of weathered some things before, those kind of heat experiences sometimes help them learn how to overcome things in tough times, right? And I think that's probably typical of like most human beings, is we're going to confront challenging things, and marriages confront those things too. And so for some couples, through the earlier heat experiences, they learn how to lean into and take what comes as an opportunity to grow. Now, something else can happen, though, that I think is challenging for some couples, and I've seen this a number of times, is there are certain couples that have actually done okay before in other kinds of situations, but when you start down the path of one's religious beliefs, it almost feels like this one's too big for us. And that, I think, in part, at least for a lot of partners in the LDS faith, is because their identities are so fused with the church and what it means to be not just a Mormon, but like Mormonism is what it means to be human to them. And so there are certain things that kind of to some couples feel, or like sometimes it's one partner or the other, like not negotiable. Like, I can handle your growth in this way, or we can handle hard things in this way, but this is one thing we cannot handle, or I cannot handle. And so I think that's one thing that I notice over and over again. I guess another side of that I could speak into just a little bit to answer your question is, I think one vulnerability is if a couple is in a relationship that is very unbalanced in terms of gender roles, I think that is going to be a unique vulnerability, especially because in this day and age, frequently due to, how we are culturally and what some of the pain points are for people on a faith journey, often it's the female partner in a heterosexual marriage that is going to be going through the faith journey at a slightly, more rapid rate, say, than the partner, right? Than the male partner. And so if you're in a traditional hierarchical, masculine, where the power base is with the man, and a woman is probably early on very much playing into or falling into her sort of, expected and validated roles according to the patriarchal structure. And then she sort of finds a mind of her own and a voice of her own. That is really undoing sometimes to the relationship, because in some ways it may feel as if everything was going just fine until you started changing and you are the one that's making the problem here. And I think that's kind of a unique variable that I notice over and over again in our specific patriarchal structure connected to the LDS Church.
Yeah. And I've definitely seen that be one of the examples as well, in the way that it not only leads to them having to navigate differences in belief, but it leads to them having to navigate totally different dynamics, relationship dynamics. Because like you said, sometimes people have been raised with this very traditional presider and supporter, and you work and she does everything in the home. And so I have definitely seen that be an example of then an awakening happening that leads those dynamics to be questioned as well, and to try to find more of a partnership that is intentional. And that can be a shock to the system, right?
Exactly.
So what are the common fears that you see showing up in these relationships? And how does that fear impact the attempts at finding connection?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the prominent word here is fear, right? I mean, I think we can return to that over and over and over again. And I think the theology discourages differentiation of self in a marriage. And therefore, when one or the other partner is experiencing life and life is teaching them things, and they are actually having experiences that are expanding their souls and helping them through, really beautiful and appropriate, normal passages of growth and development, which sometimes lead to a change of worldview or a widening or a broadening of one's ability to sort of expand one's ideas, one's capacity to love, one's compassion. That very growth, which is the most holy of things that a human can do, is seen as threatening to the system because it bumps into some of our sort of commonly accepted theological, our theology is connected to what one must think and how one must feel and how one must believe in order to go to the temple, for example, right? And so when one partner is on a faith journey and growing and they're not losing their value system, they're actually employing and deepening and broadening their value system, but that sometimes leads them to a different perspective on the world. The other partner who is equally good, right? I don't think there's no value statement based on this, but they're in a different place in their development. That partner that isn't going through this radical transformation sees their changing partner perhaps as not only just threatening, but perhaps they might experience some degree of betrayal or abandonment. And I know that a lot of what couples talk about, especially early on, is you're basically giving up our eternity together. Your choice to grow, evolve, expand, change, they're not going to use those words because those words are all very evolution in the right direction oriented. And it's more just like you're going off the deep end is basically saying you don't love me and you don't love our kids and we don't get to be together forever. And so it really puts both partners in a lot of pain.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, you talk about this differentiation and how in our culture, differentiation from the partners, like between the partners, is not necessarily encouraged. And also definitely differentiation from the religious system is discouraged in a large way.
Yeah.
The religious system is kind of meant to be our identity in a lot of ways. And so I think it's interesting because, again, our listenership is not even all LDS, right? This one religious organization. But even with those that do have a connection to it, there may be some who have distanced themselves from the institution. There may be some who are still pretty orthodox, but are embracing this fuller doctrine that is actually there in the church's doctrine and in their teachings. And it's interesting because I feel like, and I've also seen personally, how even for those who are still pretty orthodox and in all these different ways, fully supportive of the institution, but expanding their understanding of God to include their divine mother, to want to talk about her and embrace that fullness, that still can lead to so much fear from the other partner that they are leaving, that they are abandoning their covenants even when they're not, just because there's like a shift that is not the norm. There can be so much fear of where they're headed or what it could mean, and that people sometimes have a hard time even seeing where their partner is right in that moment.
Yes, what I'm picking up on in what you're saying is that we are reinforced heavily to be strictly obedient, right? And to comply with and conform to the exact teachings of the church. And that's really just an early stage faith phenomenon, right? The Mormon church doesn't own that. That's just more a product of where the system is developmentally itself in its own faith journey. And early stage faith humans and institutions are very much about conformity. It keeps people safe. It's efficient. You just lean on and trust the leader and, supposedly everything will be okay. And that keeps some degree of, I guess it's illusory, but it feels stable, right? And so the deal is, though, is human beings, we are divine and we are created to grow. And so while there will be some people that, because of their own life's experiences and other factors, growing may stay scary. They may not choose to expand beyond this idea that I just take what I am told and I believe it. That does happen, and that's That's fine. We can't, everyone's going to grow at their own pace. And yet at the same time, there's always going to be in every spiritual system and outside of spiritual systems, people whose souls are ready to grow. And by default, what that starts to mean is I am not going to just, allow beliefs to be downloaded into me. I am going to start questioning. I'm going to start looking at what my own experience is. I'm going to start assessing, does the map that has been given me match the terrain of my actual life? And our expanding souls and minds and bodies and spirits are going to be expanding such that we start actually independently thinking. And I think that's why when you get into a relationship like a marriage, it feels so threatening, when on the one hand, it's kind of like, well, who cares actually, like who one prays to? That feels very intimate and personal. That doesn't seem, it ought not to, be such a cataclysmic thing. But in some marriages, I think what happens is it's an indicator of something profound going on inside of the soul of the partner, which means, wait a minute, you're not fully conforming anymore. What does this mean? And that starts to feel, I think it's fair to say that's a legitimately scary thing for a partner, because when someone does start to independently think, what's next, right? What else? What is their next independent thought? And on and on and on. And they're not exactly wrong, the more traditionally believing partner. They're not wrong in that oftentimes one's choosing for themselves how to relate to one's divine does in fact generally mean that they're fairly far down the path of thinking independently in other beautiful and holy ways, which does feel threatening to the partner because it means they are in fact on a faith journey, and that faith journey is going to shake up the marriage.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when we're talking about this fear, some of the things that I've heard you talk about is this fear of what it means for that person religiously and doctrinally, where it's like, are you abandoning our eternal marriage, our future, and, and just the betrayal of like the church. So there's fear perhaps around that. But you also talk about the fear of change and not knowing what is coming next and what to anticipate and how to navigate that. And you also mention this sad but beautiful fear that's related to the relationship itself. This fear that you expressed of partners feeling like they are not loved anymore. Because if a person is changing the way that they feel about something that's so important to that other person, that they also fear may impact their eternal relationship, it feels like that person doesn't love them. It feels like a fear for the lack of connection and love. So there's all these different ways in which fear is presenting itself, perhaps.
Yes.
And so what impact does that fear have on the ability to try to bridge that connection?
I think it can shut it down completely. And I think it's going in both directions, actually. Oftentimes, what you described really beautifully is that there is almost like a confusion of your growth equals betrayal of me and us. And I think they come by that honestly, because I think sometimes that's taught, that like loyalty to the church equals loyalty to the partner, because the thing that bridges the two is a temple marriage, which by default means one must be in a conforming position their whole lives, but it puts the human being at odds with their own soul, because we are made to grow. And so I think the fear emerges for the more traditionally believing partner, because they do feel like if the church was this valuable to you, last year or 5 years ago, and now here you are, what's next? And a natural conclusion could be, I might be next, because you don't seem to care about the things that brought us together, and you don't seem to care about this marriage, right? And the thing that I think is the tragedy is there may be couples out there where this leads to the end of a marriage, but it's not because of the faith journey, that it was something else anyways, right? And more often than not, when somebody is on a faith journey, what they want is they want to share that journey with their partner. And I'm sure they would love it if their partner would come right along, and that does happen from time to time. But even if they don't, there's loneliness associated with one's journey when the person whom they have always, who like, if I have always shared this with you, or whatever I'm going through, the big things in my life, you're my person, and all of a sudden it's off limits, it's incredibly lonely. And so that brings up a lot of sorrow in the person who's going on the journey. And I think they may also fear, you think this is happening. You think that I'm not choosing you because growth has chosen me. And that's generally not the case. But I think the fear associated with my partner feels as if I'm abandoning her or him is very real. And sometimes that's what the partner is actually experiencing and feeling and actually even saying. And so there needs to be the way I kind of think about it. And you had mentioned wanting me to sort of integrate some of the tools and the resources that I have. The very, very first class that I ever created on helping partners where one partner is on a faith expansion journey and the other one is still more traditionally believing, is addressing this very topic. Because what couples often do, which is like the what not to do, is that the person on the faith journey starts going down the rabbit hole of polygamy or some issue, some topic. And that is generally going to end in conflict or a shutdown or something that is not necessarily going to be very, very helpful. And so the way I sort of think about this and talk about this in my first class for couples is put to the side the content topics and lean into what you're feeling and invite your partner to tell you what she or he is feeling. Because that's really what's going on under the surface anyways. It's more about you're changing, you're starting to think differently and have these independent thoughts about theology or history or whatever. And I'm scared, or I feel lonely, or I feel ashamed that I didn't do enough family home evenings, which would have kept you on the path or whatever. And so both partners are going through all of these big emotional experiences. And so what I want partners to do is stop talking about the topic, which is just going to be escalating, and it's actually just inviting all the feelings to go underground, but actually pause and say, this is what I'm feeling, but also say, I can imagine that you would be feeling this way as well. I structure these conversations very closely in my first class about this, because couples, even who do a great job in other areas, this is a big one, and it feels like everything just like goes to mush, right, in our minds and our hearts. And so what we want is to not only learn how to share what we're feeling, but to anticipate what it must feel like to be the partner.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So, I mean, in this type of example, if it were to come to discussions around like the feminine divine or something, that perhaps one partner starts sharing these things that are important to them. And if they notice the other person kind of closing up or clamming up or getting defensive or getting argumentative, stopping and kind of stepping back and addressing feelings, like what is going on for you right now, and saying, hey, right now, this is how I'm feeling. I would imagine perhaps that you're feeling this way. Is that right? What are you feeling? Are you feeling fear? Where is that fear coming from? And being able to talk about what's underneath those dynamics when we see them, stopping, taking a step back, addressing the dynamics, addressing the feelings there to help us to be able to get on solid ground again as a couple, connect as a couple, see each other, and possibly even, once you know how another person is feeling and know perhaps what their fears are, you can address those together in a way that can help you both to feel more secure and be in a better place to have those conversations later. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And this is where, like I said a few minutes ago, couples that have this skill set in other areas are often able to sort of harken back to this already existing skill set, even though this is a tougher topic. And couples that are not able to confront easier things than this are really going to struggle in this particular, right? Because I have worked with a number of couples who have had really, really sort of painful marriages. They struggle in a lot of ways, but they have the church. That's the one thing that's like, oh, it's okay, because we can come together on this one thing. And that's sort of like, it's like the one sort of stabilizing factor in their relationship. And then when one or the other partner goes on a faith journey, then it really exposes what needs to be looked at in terms of sort of like unresolved childhood trauma or issues of verbal abuse or things like that, because you're just activating so much inside of both people, because it truly is like a restructuring of one's whole worldview when one is going on a faith journey. And so for the more traditionally believing partner to be, nervous, I mean, I get it. Like, that's why I like these classes that I teach. I do everything in my power to be equal opportunity on what both partners are feeling, because it is in fact destabilizing the marriage. It is. I'm not saying that there's anything like that someone is doing anything wrong. but it is destabilizing the marriage. And so what I'm trying to do is help partners sort of normalize that this is hard. Like, because this is hard doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or that you're weird and it's easy for everybody else. It's not. And then the other thing that I think is really important to sort of integrate into this conversation is that we culturally do not necessarily understand what a healthy marriage even is, right? And so even beyond the sort of the patriarchal structure of the church, which, brings with it its own limitations, if you look at like top 40 music, it generally speaks about a fusion model of marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of like, I can't live without you. And it's fusion.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing that I think is sort of a nice thing or an important thing to sort of work into a conversation with a partner. If you are on the faith journey and you want connection with your partner and you want to get to the point where down the road you can talk about who you are becoming, is to just actually introduce in some way what a healthy marriage is. And the differentiated marriage is one where the more I am allowed to be myself, the more I have to give you. It's not the fusion model of the marriage, which is we do have to be the very same in every way, or there's something to be afraid of. And I think sometimes that's what's sort of unconsciously running in the background, is that if we don't believe the same way, how can this marriage last? And I think, again, we hear that sometimes in general conference and things like that, but that doesn't actually represent what healthy marriages are. Healthy marriages actually are where two human beings dignify the growth journey of one another and celebrate that we choose one another to witness one another grow. And in so doing, we have more of ourselves to give because ourselves become ever expanding in goodness and love and compassion and things like that. If we are allowed to differentiate and we have a partner that gives us that gift, that is so endearing. We just want to be with them.
That's beautiful. I love that image of just as we allow each other to be our own selves, that we have more of ourselves to give, in part because we're able to fill ourselves up with those things that give us life. And so we have more of that life and beauty and love and joy to give to the partnership as well. So you've talked a bit about one really important tool being addressing underlying feelings, and how important it can be to notice those dynamics and then to go back down to the emotional level to address fears and things when you see those things creeping up. Are there other tools or ground rules for compassionate dialogue? And then also, can you get to the point where you can talk about the actual issues or things that are important to you past the emotion?
Yeah.
So those are kind of two questions, and they're not,
Yeah.
Totally.
I'll tackle one, and then you can remind me of the other one.
Perfect.
So the other thing I want to say too, that's sort of all connecting all of these pieces together, is back to my first class that I was just talking to you about. I lead out the entire class, which is also the entire series, by helping the couple remember their resiliencies. When have we worked through something hard? Why did I choose you? Why do I still choose you? Why do I love you? Sometimes when couples move into a faith journey space, it's so all-consuming to both of them that they've forgotten why they love each other. And they forget that we choose each other and have all sorts of reasons why we still choose each other. And so what I try to do is really move that into the foreground, because I want people to lead with their resiliencies rather than lead with the reasons why this is painful and hard. And so that's, I think, a very important sort of first step.
And perhaps even verbalizing that to each other, right? It's like doing that internally for your own self to remind yourself, but also verbalizing that to your partner, because again, there's so much fear about this connection itself and the love itself. And so that can soothe those fears enough to embark further in connective conversations around other issues and things that are important to us.
Exactly. Couldn't say it better. In my content, there are activities and journal prompts, and there are moments where I ask people to reflect and then share with one another. What is it? Why did I choose you? How did we fall in love? And why am I still in love? Again, so that I sometimes need to hear that from you, because I'm so insecure about what's going on that I'm afraid you've forgotten. And so I think that's a really, really important piece. And something else that's just like mechanics about situations like this. I think that couples forget, and this is totally me too, in the heat of the moment, I'm so worried about defending my position that I don't care to listen to my partner's position. And so one thing that I talk about when I'm working with couples or in the classes that I have is that there are certain situations where we're going to sort of move out of organic conversation and have each partner assume the role of either the speaker or the listener. And what that means is, and both get, obviously we want both to have a chance to do that. We don't want to, end it lopsided where only one person gets to speak, but to sort of say, right now, it's my turn to share with you what I'm thinking and how I'm feeling. And then I facilitate and kind of teach the skill set of how a listener listens in a way that is inviting more, right? We validate, we reflect what they must be feeling. And this doesn't mean we have to agree with everything that they're saying. It just means that I am present for you because I want to understand. And so the speaker will speak what they're experiencing with some prompts sometimes at the very beginning, right? And it's got to be kind of structured at the beginning because we're out of our realm sometimes because of the anxiety that we're feeling. And then the receiving person or the listener validates, this must be really hard for you. Or what I think I'm hearing is this. Or what you're telling me you're experiencing is this. This is your discomfort. This is your wish. This is what happened to you. And those are your feelings. You'll notice this person is still holding on to themselves. They're not just sort of like melding into the person that's speaking, but they are actively saying, I hear you, and this is what you're telling me. And then the other part of that was sort of the validate part, validate the experience. If not again, I'm not saying one has to agree, but validating means I hear you and I'm curious and I want to make sure we're on the same page. And then the other thing that might be just as or more important is to reflect the emotional experience of the person who is sharing their experience, which is, and this is terrifying to you, or this is devastating to you, or this feels very, very lonely to you. And so what the listener is learning to do is actively listen and then connect emotionally with the person sharing so that the person sharing starts to feel safe. And then we change roles. And then in this case, say, for example, maybe we started with the person that's more, on the faith journey sharing, and then the more traditionally believing person validating and reflecting. And then we switch roles. And then that person gets to say, my experience right now under the circumstances is this, and these are my fears, and this is what I'm afraid of, and this is why I feel this way, and this and that and the other. And then the first person then goes, okay, I get it. Is it this? This is how you're feeling. And of course you would be afraid. And I can understand why you might feel that I'm abandoning you and you're afraid that I might not love you anymore. Am I getting that right? Is there anything else you can tell me about that? And so what we're doing is we're helping these partners under very, very anxiety-inducing situations sort of slow things down. And even if the couple can only tolerate this for like 30 to 60 seconds each, even that is a huge step in the right direction. And I had a couple come on my show a few months ago that walked through this whole process. And the husband was a very, very devout member of the bishopric. And his wife was over there, in his mind's eye at first, just going nuts on him, right?
Oh, goodness.
And the agony of those first, I don't remember how long the arc was a rather long arc. And finally, how they were able to start having these exact conversations. It was a few years in. I mean, it was not easy, but then them coming on and saying how transformed their marriage was when both of them paused and just started asking each other, what's happening with you, and being able to actually, in fact, hold space for one another. I mean, that's really true intimacy right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One thing that I feel like I have seen is when you are navigating these types of relationships, it's like it takes so much more time to talk about and work through the dynamics of conversations than it does even sometimes having conversations, right? Where it's like you are maybe wanting to talk about something beautiful in your new belief system or the way that you feel about things, and it throws up defenses or fear for your partner. And then you have to spend all of this time talking about that dynamic and about each other's feelings and listening. And I think that's really not natural for most of us to take that time. And so sometimes it may feel stunted or it may feel unnatural because, like you're saying, perhaps you need to make it really rigid, where it's like, this is this partner's turn. And it's not conversation time. It's their turn, and it's your turn to listen. And then you need to reflect back and validate and recognize validating doesn't mean agreeing necessarily, but trying to understand fully where your partner is coming from and what they're feeling and what their experience is, and then taking turns. How do you manage relationships where perhaps a partner is unwilling to engage in that type of back and forth?
Sadly, I have reports that that's frequently going on in a lot of marriages. And I think what sometimes needs to happen is, I almost think that there's like a life cycle of the faith journey in a marriage. And you can have a really pretty solid, strong marriage. And when one partner begins to go on a faith journey and the other partner is devout, I think the very beginnings of that is going to be rocky. Like, it's just going to be hard because it's shocking. It's frightening. The partner that is feeling left behind doesn't know how to handle this, that we don't have resources in the Orthodox Latter-day Saint world to normalize this as part of many marriages' journeys. So they don't even trust some of the good resources that are, on the edges, that really care about marriages. And oftentimes what their response is going to be some variation of aggression or shutting down.
Yeah.
And so I think that's normal, and maybe to just encourage the partner who's on the faith journey to have compassion, to take baby steps, to invite authenticity in other areas of the marriage so that perhaps trust can grow, and the partner that's not yet willing to talk about it, their defenses can perhaps fall a little bit when they notice that, like, oh, she or he is going through something that scares me and I don't want to talk about it. But in other realms of our marriage, she or he seems to be thriving or seems to feel just fine, or in other ways doesn't seem to be proving or strengthening the narrative they've made up in their head about the inevitable, demise of the marriage and family. And so I think that a time period has to pass. I will say too, though, that let me be more upbeat for a second. I've noticed that dynamic in marriages, and I have returned, or I've learned as time has gone by, that there is a shift, and the marriage, like, the person softens and recognizes it's okay, opens up, and is able to make space for the otherness of the other. That happens, and it just warms my heart and makes my day. Now, if we were to swing to the other side of the pendulum, it is my belief that in pretty much every relationship that we experience, sometimes we have to grieve that the relationship will not be what we wish, but we just maintain it, like maybe a mother or a sibling or an adult child. Sometimes somebody just really cannot handle our faith journey, and we wish they could, and we try, and we just recognize that this isn't going to happen, and we have to grieve it and reshape the relationship. It is not my feeling that a married partner should have to grieve intimacy in their marriage for the long haul. And so I definitely feel that patience and compassion and time is important. I also feel that at some point in time, it does become necessary for some people. I don't want to prescribe this for everybody, but I think sometimes it's important for some people to say, listen, I'm so lonely. I want to grow. I want to thrive. I want to be married to you. I need you to be able to let me grow and thrive if this is going to be sustainable.
Yeah. And I'm grateful that you are making space for that too, because everyone's journey is different and their circumstances are different.
Yes.
And so what they are going to need and their path may look like is going to be different. And so thank you for acknowledging that as well for those who get to that point and need to be able to have those conversations and make choices that are best for them and their family. That may be hard, really, really hard. So are there other tools that I know that you have, like, all these courses about it, so we can't go through everything, but if you were to give maybe one more tool that might be helpful for our listeners that are trying to navigate some of these conversations, what would be maybe perhaps one more exercise or tool that may help them in navigating these conversations?
Yeah, You and I had talked a little bit before about how complicated it is for a couple to be going through a faith, a shift in their dynamics in their marriage. And then you throw in parenting on top of that. And in some ways, it seems almost like all consuming. Like I can hardly even do this with one person, much less with, 3 or 4 children or something like that. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about that for a second.
Perfect. Yeah, kind of navigating those conversations
Yes.
about parenting and
Yes.
how to manage when different people have different ways that they want to teach their children or parent their children when it comes to religion, or ways that they want to involve different things that their spouse may not feel as comfortable with.
Yeah. And again, just from the gate, this is hard stuff, right? I think for many of us that enter into a marriage, we choose someone that frequently looks a lot like us. And we sort of have this imagination of what life is going to look like. And, the baptismal day and all of these various sort of like rites of passage that define this very, like a euphemistic, perfect Mormon family life unfolding. And then for some, it works for a while until it doesn't. And so when we enter into this space of growth, it does require couples and parents to really, really lean into skills that oftentimes they don't really have until they practice them. We need to learn how to negotiate. We need to learn how to meet in the middle. We need to learn how and practice letting go of certain rigidly held beliefs or ideas or fantasies of how something was supposed to look, and grieve those things without it becoming something that becomes a resentment against the other partner. One of the activities that I use that I think is beautiful and very centering for families that couples can do themselves, or that couples can integrate with their children, or they can even integrate this activity in a large decision. And it's in my first class on mixed faith parenting, becoming values-based parents. And I do an activity called the core value activity. And it's where I help the couple or the family transition away from being a family that is a beliefs-based family and towards becoming a values-based family. And the reason why this tends to work quite well in our space is because the faith journey is the product of someone actually living out their values. And sometimes the more traditionally believing partner doesn't see that early on. It feels scary and like a departure in their values. Because, say, for example, maybe someone starts dressing differently, and to them, that translates into a loss of value, whereas it may mean something completely different. And so what I want couples to recognize is that both partners, even though they are expressing their values differently, oftentimes are living from a place of integrity, that they're both trying to be honest. They're both trying to be kind or loving or obedient or whatever that is. And so I have an activity where it's almost like a Venn diagram where each partner can, and you can throw the kids in too, like what are your 3 or 4 most important core values? And then you start looking at where do they overlap? And how can we recognize that even though we look different, or maybe things look different on a Sunday morning than they used to, all of us value service. Okay, what can service look like in this family where, yeah, we maybe believe certain things a little bit differently, but at the core of who we are, can we go to a homeless shelter and help people on Christmas Eve? And that's aligning everybody's values at their core with who they are, independent of affiliation. And you can take that core idea and you can take it in any number of directions to help families recognize that affiliation or specific like flavor of belief matters much less than the core values that each of us holds. And sometimes, even if the value systems are slightly different, it may be that you value obedience and I value compassion. But then we can even use those core values to honor and respect one another. And I can come your way a little bit about something that matters a lot to you about obedience, but you can come my way a little bit about what matters to me when it comes to compassion. And we can actually teach our children to be values-based, which is far more important to the cultivation of a safe, loving human being in the world, meaning that if a child is values-based as opposed to beliefs-based, and they get themselves in a situation that could be dangerous, how they behave, if they are at their core coming from their values, is going to provide them a great deal more safety than whether or not one does something because someone was told to do it. Right? Because sometimes that doesn't sink very deeply in, and it does put people in harm's way because they don't really know what their values are, because oftentimes they never were really asked about that.
Yeah.
They just sort of took it in and believed it. So this has all sorts of really, really powerful applications, both in the family and in marriage, to really remember who we are. And at our core, we have much more in common than I think sometimes we think we have when we are just, when we're shifting beliefs around sort of like religious affiliation.
Yeah. And I think that can be so powerful too, just going through the exercise of discussing your values in general. I feel like that can even be such a beautiful bridge to perhaps lessen fear as well, because often when people are going through some kind of shift, part of the fear is that, are they not going to be a good person anymore? Are they not going to care about all these values? And so recognizing that perhaps a shift in belief doesn't at all necessarily mean a total change or abandonment of values, and still acknowledging, those core values. And then, like you're saying, finding shared values to emphasize with your family, and also being willing to give and take a little bit and allow space for both partners in the way that they contribute the other values that may be a little bit different in the teaching of their children and their family. What about with parents trying to navigate teaching their children specific things? So, for example, on the nature of God, perhaps you have a couple where one partner is really a traditional Latter-day Saint and may believe that they shouldn't teach their children about Heavenly Mother because she's too sacred to talk about. And then they have a partner who feels very strongly that they should teach their children about their divine mother. Or one believes in a feminine divine and wants to teach their children about the feminine divine or heavenly parents. And one parent is perhaps agnostic or atheist and doesn't believe that there is a God. And they both perhaps want to be able to teach their children these things that are very important to them. How can they navigate figuring out how to both be able to teach their children their different beliefs when it comes to those sorts of things?
Yeah, I'm loving your question, because it almost is like we planned this more specifically than we even planned this, because I actually addressed this directly in my third class on mixed faith parenting called, we didn't even plan this, but Mastering Mixed Faith Family Life. And one of the things I cover in that is a list of myths that are pretty pervasive about mixed faith parenting. And one of the myths is it's just too confusing for kids to hear about different systems. That's a myth that is debunked, because what children thrive in is openness and compassion and feeling safe in their homes. That's what we know. And so if you have a couple who has done the hard work of honoring and respecting the journey of one another, what this can end up looking like is two parents modeling deep love and respect for one another with witnessing children that can watch mom and dad navigate this in such a way that if you were, say, for example, specifically talking about God, like you had just mentioned in a child could sit with parents and learn what dad believes, and then dad could say, this is what I think and feel, and this is how I came by it, and whatever, at the age appropriate level, of course. And he could look over at a partner and say, well, you sure, what do you believe? Or vice versa, right? So that the child doesn't feel, first of all, threat, like there's something scary, or there's a right way and a wrong way, or the child isn't made to feel that they must choose between, the mom or the dad, or that there's something threatening about people having different beliefs.
Right.
So what we're integrating so much openness and compassion in a moment like that, because if you can imagine a child watching mom and dad in this constellation of family comfortably talking about this in a non-threatening way, asking the child, how do you feel? What do you think? Then the child enters into the world, and when they bump into friends and loved ones who believe differently, then there's nothing new. They're used to loving and respecting people believing as they see fit, which, by the way, is one of the articles of faith of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to believe that we can and ought to worship God how and where and when we feel. And so all we're just doing is actually creating structure for a child to become incredibly healthy as a human being in that condition.
Absolutely. I think it's such a beautiful gift. It actually can provide your kids with like the best example of
Yes.
that because it's within their own home.
Yep.
But I think also it can take a lot of emotional work sometimes in certain relationships for parents to get to the place where they can model that so beautifully. And so perhaps in the meantime, recognizing that we have to make space for each other. I think about even growing up in a place where there was a lot of diversity. And, the high school that I went to was less than 50% white. And it was just a mix of all these different groups. And there's no better way to learn than through experience. I grew up knowing that it was okay that people were different from each other, that people came from different cultural backgrounds, that everyone had something beautiful to contribute, and that I didn't have to be afraid of people who were different than me. And I currently live in Utah, but it was something that I was sad about moving to Utah because I wanted to provide my children with that same hands-on experience of knowing and understanding that all people who are different from us, whether it be religion or race or whatever it may be, are beautiful, wonderful human beings that we don't need to be afraid of. And so it's that same principle in this marriage that if they can grow up seeing within their own family that example being given, then that can teach that lesson so much more deeply than conversations saying, it's okay for people to believe differently when they're not actually seeing it in action. And so I think shifting that mindset to it being an opportunity to give a gift to your kids.
Couldn't agree more.
So we are just about done, but I would love, because, one of the questions that one of our listeners asked when I was asking for what they would like us to address in this conversation, one person asked, basically, is it really possible for couples who are in these mixed belief relationships, mixed faith relationships, whatever it may be, to thrive long term? Because I think you can tell there is some pain behind that, that for some it feels impossible. And as you said, maybe in the past, maybe there are some situations where if a spouse is completely unwilling to allow their partner to be their own human being, maybe in those types of situations, perhaps it's not. But I would love to hear example from you, perhaps, that you have seen in your own practice of a couple who was struggling, but who has been able to learn these skills and to connect more fully and to let it be something that strengthened their relationship, that helped it to become even stronger. Could you kind of answer that question and provide an example of hope for us?
Yeah, I was actually, as I was listening to you, I have several examples actually. So, my short answer is yes, couples can thrive in mixed faith marriages. And the reason why they can thrive is because couples that are committed to personal growth are by default going to honor and respect the growth of their partner. I think the short answer I'll give on the ones that don't thrive are the ones where one partner or both partners rigidly doesn't want the other to be different than themselves.
Mm.
And so if that is going on and there is no shift in that, then there is high risk that marriage is either not going to last, or it will last, but it'll be very unsatisfying, right? It'll be just a marriage of necessity or convenience or whatever you want to call it. And I do see those as well. But the couples that start out with a bumpy road, which I think is pretty typical, at least in our tradition, and go through some pretty significant valleys of shadows, they soften into a realization that, and this is one component part that I've heard over and over again from couples, is that at some point in time, usually the fear of the partner on the journey, as they evolve and recognize that this is a faith journey that embodies more and more love, they become, or potentially can become, more compassionate, right? And then the more traditionally believing partner oftentimes comes to a moment where something occurs to them that shifts everything. And it's interesting because I've heard this from a number of people. That more traditionally believing partner will sometimes realize that I have been rigidly holding on to my fears because I thought that's what Jesus wanted me to do. And the click in their minds and hearts is, I have been invited to love. And the embodiment of what God wants me to do is actually to soften up and love my partner and choose to let my partner be who they are and to believe them and to have compassion for them. And when that happens, oftentimes it doesn't feel like it's as scary or hard of a choice, and it doesn't feel like a betrayal of God, because they're actually recognizing that my rigidity in an effort to sort of obey God was misplaced. And what actually God wants is for me to love my husband or my wife and allow them to grow and metabolize my fear about what this means, and to just trust in a God that's going to work it all out in the end, even though theologically maybe they don't understand how that's going to look anymore, but they're going to be like, you know what? A loving God doesn't want me estranged from my wife or my husband and my children. And a loving God is not going to punish us for loving one another more deeply and for having respect for their journey. And when that clicks, it's just like things change, and they're able to embrace, or at very least tolerate with a lot of compassion, the changes of their partner. And this does not mean that they must follow suit and become exactly like their partner. I have a lot of partnerships where one partner still goes to church and the other one doesn't. To give you a specific clinical example, one of the more touching stories that I remember hearing is one relationship well into their journey where there had been a lot of bitterness and a lot of contention. They reported back to me the success of one day, the husband was the attender and the wife was the non-attender, and he had to prepare a Sunday school lesson, but really had wanted to go golfing. And the time was running out, the day was short, and his wife offered to prepare his Sunday school lesson for him so that he could go golfing. She hadn't been to church in years. She'd grown up she's like, I'm very capable of preparing a Sunday school lesson. And she did. And for them, that was one of the greatest victories of their marriage, because it was so deeply touching to him that she was supporting him where he was. And when we sort of processed that, the reason why she said she could do that for him is because he had been so incredibly supportive of her after he surrendered his rigidity and decided that a loving God is going to make this okay, and I can just accept my wife as she is. And so that's just like one of those small and simple things, but it was big. And I think it's possible for a lot of couples.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Valerie, we appreciate your time so much. We appreciate you sharing your experiences, your knowledge, all the professional work that you have done and the wisdom from that. And then these beautiful stories as well that offer hope. You have worked with these couples. You've seen many of these couples grow so deeply and thrive. Yes. Much more fully. I am so grateful we've been able to have you on here. I feel like this conversation will be really of great benefit to a lot of our listeners. And again, there are some who this is not a thing at all, where it's just brought greater joy and connection and closeness. But there are those who really are struggling to figure out how to build that greater connection as one or both partners change in different ways. So thank you so much. We appreciate you. We are sending love to all of our listeners who may be dealing with this as well. And thank you for coming on.
It's always a pleasure to be with you on this platform, and I think you do wonderful work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, we invite you to come on over to patreon.com/inherimagepodcast for more content and community. You will have opportunities to participate in Q&A sessions, quarterly book clubs, access to a Marco Polo or Facebook group chat with our hosts, and the insider scoop on events, meetups, and retreats. We're so excited to meet you. Tune in next Sunday for another inspiring episode.